When I saw him pull into the driveway earlier than expected, my breath caught in my throat, not because I was doing anything wrong in that exact moment, but because I wasn't ready. Not ready to hide what needed hiding. The coffee cups were still warm. The faint trace of his cousin's cologne lingered in the air like a warning. I stood motionless, watching my husband step out of the car, completely unaware that the life he believed he was returning to had quietly, irreversibly shifted. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should open a window, let the air clear, erase the scent. But it was too late. His footsteps echoed through the hall while my mind screamed through everything I had to conceal. A part of me hoped he'd notice. A deeper part hoped he wouldn't. And as I stood there, hand trembling on the edge of the countertop, the silence between the two closed doors in our home became unbearable. That day wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything I never thought I was capable of. Before I tell you how it happened, and how I became the woman I promised I'd never be, tell me where you're watching this from, and answer honestly, have you ever felt invisible in your own home, only to realize too late how dangerous being seen can truly be? I used to think that love, real love, was something that grew quieter over time, so quiet, in fact, that you only noticed its absence when someone else made noise. Looking back, I can't say our marriage was a bad one. It was predictable. Safe. A life organized by decades of routines, divided between the hum of appliances and the silence of polite distance. He was a good man. Still is, probably. But I had become invisible to him. No, worse, I had become familiar. The day of my 53rd birthday started like any other. I woke before him, brewed the coffee, folded the laundry he'd left in the dryer the night before, and sat at the edge of the bed to rub moisturizer into my hands while the morning news murmured in the background. He didn't say anything. He reached for his phone, yawned, and mumbled something about an early call. No kiss, no happy birthday. I waited. I gave him the entire morning to remember. He didn't. It wasn't anger I felt. Just the hollow sting of confirmation. That small voice in my head whispering, "You don't matter." I dressed slowly, deliberately. A blouse I hadn't worn in a while, soft teal, form-fitting but tasteful. I curled my hair. Mascara, just enough. When I passed by the hallway mirror, I paused. I still looked like me. But when he walked past me to leave for work, his only words were, "Did you pay the water bill?" That was it. No glance, no pause. The first person to acknowledge my birthday was our neighbor. She caught me outside near the hedges and smiled, asked how I planned to celebrate. "Oh, you know. Quiet dinner," I lied. She didn't press. Just said I looked lovely, glowing even, and wished me a beautiful day. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. But I clung to it like a branch in deep water. Later that afternoon, my husband called. Not to apologize. Not to invite me anywhere. Just to inform me that his cousin was arriving that evening. He said it as though I already knew, as if I were part of the planning. Just for a few days. He's got that thing in the city. You'll be fine, right? I said yes. Of course I said yes. I'd met the cousin before. A few holidays here and there, a wedding once, years ago. He was younger, maybe by 5 or 6 years, and had this easy way about him, charm without trying, presence without volume. I hadn't thought of him much until that evening when he stood on our front steps, suitcase in one hand, casual smile on his face, and said, "You haven't changed a bit." It caught me off guard. Not because it was a lie, it wasn't, but because no one had said anything like that to me in years. He stepped inside and filled the house with something unfamiliar. Not just his voice or the thud of his bag against the floor, but an awareness. I became conscious of the way I moved, the way I stood, even the way I smoothed my skirt. He wasn't flirtatious. Not in the overt sense. But his eyes met mine when we spoke, and he listened. Fully, intently. My husband, by contrast, ate dinner that night while scrolling through his phone. He didn't ask how my day had been. Didn't comment when I brought out wine. His cousin did. "You always host like this?" he asked, raising his glass. Elegant. The compliment shouldn't have meant anything. But it did. I blushed. I hadn't blushed in years. And suddenly I felt like a woman again, not just a role. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way the cousin's eyes crinkled when he laughed. About how he helped carry in the groceries without being asked. About how, when we crossed paths in the hallway, he stepped aside with a smile instead of walking through me like I was furniture. I stared at the ceiling and wondered how I had become this person, grateful for crumbs of attention. I wasn't proud of it. But I wasn't ashamed yet either. Just aware. The next day, he joined me in the kitchen while I prepared lunch. I was chopping tomatoes, and he reached over to grab a knife. Our hands brushed. A simple thing. A nothing thing. But my breath caught. "Sorry," he said softly. I shook my head. "It's fine." We didn't speak for a moment. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was charged. That evening, my husband mentioned he'd have to leave early the next day. "That thing in Harrisburg," he said. "Back late." I nodded. "Of course." Later, after dinner, I found myself in the den while the cousin unpacked in the guest room. I picked up the remote, flicked through the channels, and then set it down again. I wasn't watching anything. Just listening. Listening to footsteps. Drawers opening. A soft hum. I used to be the one who hummed. By the time I went to bed, I felt something buzzing beneath my skin. Not quite guilt. Not quite fear. Just anticipation. The sense that something had already begun, whether I wanted it to or not. And the worst part? I didn't know whether I wanted it to stop. The next morning began with an almost imperceptible shift in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I noticed it as I moved through the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator louder than usual, the clink of the spoon in my coffee mug sounding more deliberate. I was keenly aware of every sound, every movement, like my senses had been sharpened overnight. I couldn't say why exactly, only that something inside me was bracing for a moment that hadn't yet come. He was already in the kitchen when I entered. He'd made coffee, my kind, not my husband's. He handed me a cup without a word, the simple gesture sending a ripple through my chest. I took it with a nod, careful not to let our fingers touch. That level of awareness wasn't normal. Not for two people who had no reason to be anything but polite. We sat in silence at opposite ends of the kitchen island, the only sound the occasional sip from our mugs and the occasional chirp of birds outside. I didn't know what to say, so I asked the safe question. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," he replied. "Your guest bed's more comfortable than I expected." I laughed. A light, airy sound that surprised even me. "That's a first." He smiled at me, and it lingered a second too long. I turned away, busying myself with the dishes, pretending to need to rinse a spoon that was already clean. My pulse was doing strange things. I told myself it was nothing. Just attention. That's all it was. Attention I hadn't received in years. Later that morning, my husband asked if we could do the grocery run. "Since you're both here," he said, placing the list on the counter and checking his watch. "I've got back-to-back calls. Shouldn't take long, right?" The days that followed were marked by a strange kind of stillness, the kind that hangs between two people who've shared something irreversible but agreed, without speaking, to pretend otherwise. Nothing was said about the kiss. There were no lingering glances, no sly smiles, no apologies. On the surface, everything returned to normal. But inside, I felt altered. Every movement now held tension, as though my body remembered more than my mind allowed. I became acutely aware of every step I took around him, every brush of air when we passed in the hallway, every unspoken moment in which my mind wandered back to the brief second our lips met. I told myself to forget it. I promised myself I would. But that promise, like so many before it, was more for comfort than conviction. My husband didn't notice anything. Or if he did, he didn't care enough to mention it. He remained immersed in his work, his endless calls, his quiet dinners filled with absent-minded chewing and distracted nods. I was a presence in the room, not a person. A soundless figure moving in and out of his periphery. One afternoon, he suggested we all go to the city for a museum exhibit. You and my cousin have both been stuck here for days. Might as well get some fresh air, he said, as if granting us a favor. He booked the tickets, but an hour before we were supposed to leave, he received a call and shrugged apologetically. You two go without me. No point wasting the tickets. I felt my stomach sink. A part of me wanted to object, to insist we cancel altogether. But another part, one I was still afraid to acknowledge, didn't mind the idea of spending a few hours alone with someone who saw me. The car ride was quiet. Not awkward, just calm. The kind of calm that comes from mutual restraint. I kept my gaze fixed on the road ahead, my hands clutched too tightly around the steering wheel. It's okay to breathe, he said lightly after a few minutes. I'm not going to bring it up. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. That statement alone told me everything I needed to know. We were walking a line together, and neither of us wanted to tip over it just yet. The museum was quiet, as most are on weekday afternoons. We moved slowly, observing art without much comment. Sometimes he would make a dry joke, and I'd laugh too loudly. Sometimes I'd catch his expression softening at a painting I didn't understand. But mostly, we stayed close but separate. I couldn't tell if we were keeping distance or maintaining safety. At one point, we stood in front of a large canvas, abstract and stormy, full of jagged lines and heavy brushstrokes. I tilted my head, trying to make sense of it. It looks like noise, I said finally. He was quiet for a moment, then replied, it looks like restraint breaking. I turned to him, surprised by the weight in his voice. But he didn't elaborate. He moved on to the next piece, leaving me there, staring at chaos on a canvas and wondering if it mirrored something inside me. We didn't stay long after that. On the way home, the air between us grew heavier. Not hostile, just full. Like the silence meant more than it should have. I opened the windows a little, hoping the breeze would ease the tightness in my chest. Back home, my husband was still on a call. He waved at us without removing his headset and pointed vaguely toward the kitchen, where takeout containers sat on the counter. Help yourselves, he mouthed. And that was that. We ate in near silence again, the clinking of cutlery louder than usual. After dinner, I escaped to the garden under the guise of checking on the wilting hydrangeas. He joined me without asking. We didn't speak. We stood a few feet apart in the cooling dusk, listening to the faint hum of cicadas and distant traffic. I leave soon, he said finally. I didn't answer. He didn't clarify. Eventually, I nodded and went back inside. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed long after my husband had fallen asleep. I didn't move. I didn't undress. I just sat there, frozen in the dim light of the bedside lamp, trying to decipher what I wanted and what I was afraid of. I thought of the cousin's words in the museum. Restraint breaking. It echoed in my head like a warning and a temptation. I wasn't sure which. The next morning, I woke before everyone and went for a walk. Something I hadn't done in years. The air was crisp, the streets quiet, and for a while, I allowed myself the luxury of pretending I was just a woman taking a stroll, not a wife, not a host, not someone teetering on the edge of an emotional cliff. When I returned, he was in the kitchen again, sipping coffee and reading the paper. He looked up when I walked in. "Good walk?" he asked. "Yes," I said simply. And that was the end of it. We went through the rest of the day like actors in a play we hadn't rehearsed. Smiling when necessary, speaking only when required, moving around each other like shadows. But that night, lying in bed beside my husband, I realized something had shifted again. Not just between me and the cousin, but within me. I was no longer the same woman who had spent years drifting through rooms, unnoticed and unneeded. I had been seen. And whether I liked it or not, I couldn't unsee myself anymore. The house grew quieter over the next few days, as if it, too, sensed the weight of restraint pressing against its walls. My husband continued his routines with mechanical efficiency, up early, calls through lunch, eyes fixed to screens long after dinner. He asked few questions, made fewer observations. I wondered sometimes if he noticed how little I spoke, how much time I spent outside or behind closed doors. But if he did, he gave no sign of it. The cousin, meanwhile, became a quieter presence. He wasn't avoiding me, but something between us had shifted. He was more careful now. More deliberate in his distance. He didn't linger in the kitchen or walk beside me through the hallways. If we crossed paths, it was always with polite nods and brief exchanges. As though we were both trying to undo something that had already been done. I tried to convince myself that it had worked, that the silence had erased the kiss. But nothing had been erased. It had only been buried beneath layers of guilt and discipline. And like anything buried too shallowly, it still breathed beneath the surface. One morning, I found myself rearranging books in the living room, a task no one had asked for and no one would notice. I wasn't reading them. I was just moving them. A distraction. A futile effort to assert some control over the shape of things. He walked in while I was doing it. He paused at the threshold, eyes scanning the scene, books stacked unevenly on the coffee table, pillows out of place, dust unsettled in the air. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said quietly. "You're not," I replied, not looking up. He hesitated before stepping inside. He moved to the shelf nearest the window and picked up a small ceramic figure, a swan I'd bought years ago on a trip we never talked about anymore. "This one's always looked out of place here," he said gently, turning it in his hand. "I know," I said. "I never liked it, but I kept it anyway." He placed it down slowly, precisely, then looked at me. "Some things we hold on to out of habit." The words weren't about the swan. We both knew that. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything more. He left the room without another word, and I stood still for a long time, staring at the space he had vacated. The silence he left behind felt louder than any conversation we might have had. That night, my husband brought home takeout and suggested we have dinner on the patio. It was a rare gesture of spontaneity, and I agreed without thinking. We ate under the dim glow of string lights he'd hung 2 summers ago and never bothered to take down. He spoke more than usual, stories from work, a joke someone had told, something about stocks or politics, I don't remember. I nodded at the right moments, offered small smiles, but I wasn't really listening. My mind kept drifting to the man sitting just inside the house, the one I couldn't see but whose presence I could still feel like a pressure behind glass. After dinner, my husband took a call and wandered back into the house, leaving his half-empty wine glass beside mine. I stayed out, needing the cool night air to calm my nerves. A few minutes later, I heard the screen door creak open behind me. I didn't turn around. "You forgot your sweater," he said, placing it over the back of my chair. "Thank you." He didn't leave right away. He stood beside me, both of us facing the garden, saying nothing. The silence stretched. Finally, he spoke, voice low. "This is hard." I closed my eyes for a moment. "I know. I'm leaving soon. Maybe that's for the best." "Maybe," I whispered. We didn't say anything else. He turned and walked back inside, the screen door clicking softly behind him. I stayed there, unmoving, until the night grew too cold to bear. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. I needed space. I needed somewhere that didn't echo with memory. I told my husband I'd go to the market in town. He grunted from behind his coffee mug, more preoccupied with his phone than my words. I left without eating, drove slowly, windows down, letting the wind clear my head. The market was half empty, the quiet buzz of vendors and the scent of fresh bread soothing in a way I hadn't expected. I wandered without urgency, placing things in my basket that I didn't need. Flowers, mostly. Peaches I probably wouldn't eat. A jar of local honey. When I returned home, the house was still. I carried the bags inside and paused at the kitchen table. A folded note sat there with my name written neatly across the front. My heart dropped. I opened it slowly. "I'm going away for a couple of days. Needed to clear my head. Thank you for the hospitality." No signature. None was needed. I read it twice. Then a third time. And then I placed it face down on the counter and continued unpacking the groceries like nothing had changed. Because nothing had. Not really. But as I set the flowers in a vase and peeled the sticker from the honey jar, I felt something press against my chest, grief, maybe. Or guilt. Or the slow realization that even the most delicate moments can leave bruises. That evening, my husband asked what I bought. I listed the items one by one, my voice even, my expression practiced. He nodded and went back to reading the news. And just like that, the house returned to its quiet. But I didn't. Something in me had shifted. Something I couldn't name. And I knew it wouldn't be the last time I felt it. He returned 2 days later without warning. I had just finished folding the last of the laundry when I heard the door creak open. For a moment, I thought it was my husband coming back from his walk, but the rhythm of the footsteps was different, quieter, more deliberate. I stayed frozen in place, socks still clutched in my hands, my breath held just long enough to make my chest ache. When he appeared in the doorway, suitcase in hand, I didn't say anything. Neither did he. He nodded once, as if acknowledging that silence was safer than words, and carried his things to the guest room. The house swallowed him back like he'd never left, and I stood there, staring at the hallway, wondering what I was supposed to feel. Later that afternoon, we crossed paths in the kitchen. He was unpacking a paper bag of groceries, apples, some crackers, a small jar of jam, things he hadn't brought with him originally. I opened the fridge to avoid eye contact, pretending to rearrange things that didn't need rearranging. When I closed the door, he was leaning back against the counter, watching me. "You've been okay?" he asked, voice quiet. "Yes," I answered, and it was mostly true. A pause. I didn't mean to leave without more of a goodbye. I didn't expect one. He nodded, and I thought that was the end of it. But then he stepped closer, not enough to cross any lines, but enough for me to feel the change in air between us. "Are we pretending again?" he asked. I didn't answer. Not then. I walked past him, close enough that our arms brushed. It wasn't accidental. I wish I could say it was. Dinner that night was awkward in the way that only silence between three people can be. My husband was distracted, as usual, scrolling on his tablet between bites. The cousin sat across from me, polite and restrained. I focused on my plate. We spoke only about practical things, what needed to be picked up at the store, how long the hot water had been acting up, whether it might rain later in the week. Conversations that filled the air but meant nothing. When the dishes were done, and my husband retreated to his office, I stepped out into the backyard. I needed air. The evening sky was soft with streaks of fading pink, and the breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine from the neighbor's garden. I wrapped my arms around myself, unsure whether it was the wind or something inside me that made me feel cold. I heard the door behind me slide open, then close again. I didn't turn. He walked up beside me and stood silently for a while. We both watched the sky darken. "You looked different when I came back," he said. "Like something settled in you." Maybe something did. He didn't press. He just nodded and looked away. "Why did you come back?" I asked after a long pause. "I wasn't finished," he said simply. I didn't ask what that meant. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Later that night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, I kept thinking about the way the cousin's eyes had lingered on me during dinner, not with hunger or guilt, but with something far more dangerous, recognition. He saw me. Still. Even after everything, he saw me. And I was starting to realize how much I needed that. The next morning, my husband had to leave early for a meeting out of town. He kissed my cheek absently before heading out, his breath still carrying the scent of coffee, his mind clearly elsewhere. He didn't say when he'd be back. I stood at the window after he left, watching his car disappear down the street. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. The kind that fills every room, every crack between the floorboards. I went about my morning as usual, washing dishes, feeding the cat, making the bed, until I ran out of things to clean or rearrange. Then I stood in the center of the living room, unsure what to do next. I felt the weight of possibility pressing against me from all sides. I found him on the back patio, reading a book. He looked up when I approached but didn't say anything. I sat down across from him, folding my hands in my lap. We didn't speak for several minutes. The quiet stretched long and thin between us. Then he closed the book and set it aside. "You're shaking," he said. "I know. You don't have to be afraid of me." "I'm not afraid of you," I replied, and it was true. "I'm afraid of myself." He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. We kissed. The words felt heavier when I said them aloud. He didn't flinch. "Yes," he said. "We did." I didn't know what I expected him to say after that. Maybe a suggestion that we forget it happened, or worse, that we pick up where we left off. But he didn't offer either. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I just don't want to pretend that I don't think about it." "I think about it too," I admitted. Silence again. This time, it felt heavier. Not awkward. Just full. We didn't move. We didn't reach for each other. But something passed between us in that stillness. A quiet agreement, unspoken and unsealed, that neither of us would run anymore. We kissed. This time, there was no hesitation, no frantic breath, no confusion. It was deliberate. It was slow. And it ended just as quietly as it began. I stood up and walked away without saying a word. He didn't follow. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed long after the lights were out. My husband had texted to say he'd be staying overnight in the city. Something about meetings running late. I held my phone in my hands for a long time, staring at his message, reading it over and over. Then I turned off the screen, placed it face down on the nightstand, and climbed into bed. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, heart still pounding, skin still alive with the memory of that moment. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. The morning after was strangely still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace but from the weight of something unsaid settling over every corner of the house. I woke earlier than usual, the sky outside just beginning to pale with light. I sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the quiet. My husband wasn't beside me, he was still in the city, as his text had said. That gave me time. Time for what, I didn't yet know. I walked down the hallway barefoot, the cold wooden floor grounding me as I moved. In the kitchen, the kettle whistled softly as I boiled water for tea. Everything felt ordinary, even though nothing was. My hands moved out of habit, mug, tea bag, honey, but my mind was elsewhere, looping back to the moment on the patio. The second kiss. Deliberate. I hadn't allowed myself to call it betrayal, not yet. That word was too final, too unforgiving. And I didn't feel like a villain. I felt like a person who had cracked under the pressure of being unseen for too long. When I stepped into the living room with my tea, I found him already there. He was sitting by the window, reading, or pretending to. The light caught his face in a way that made him look older than I remembered. More tired. But also more real. We didn't speak. I sat in the armchair opposite, my tea untouched on the small table beside me. I wasn't ready for conversation. I wasn't even sure what there was left to say. Eventually, he looked up. Not at me, just through the window, at the garden beyond. It's strange, being here. Knowing it's temporary. His words landed softly, but they didn't pass through me. They caught somewhere deep, like a thread snagged on a nail. I nodded, but didn't answer. I sipped my tea, though it had already gone lukewarm. The rest of the morning unfolded in a blur of silence and avoidance. We kept to opposite ends of the house, orbiting one another without touching. I cleaned the bathroom, not because it needed it, but because scrubbing something tangible gave my thoughts less space to unravel. He stayed mostly in the guest room, the door half closed, a sign that he neither wanted company nor wanted to shut the world out entirely. By mid-afternoon, I needed to leave the house. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. I grabbed my keys and purse without a plan. When I walked through the living room, he glanced up from his book. Going out, he asked. Just for a drive, I replied. Clear my head. He didn't stop me. Just nodded again, that same quiet gesture he always used when there was too much underneath to say aloud. I drove without destination, letting the turns happen on their own. Past the market, past the school, past the same familiar streets that now looked different simply because I did. I ended up at the park on the edge of town. It was mostly empty, just a few parents with small children, a jogger, an elderly man feeding birds. I sat on a bench beneath a large oak tree, its branches gently swaying in the breeze. For a while, I didn't think. I just watched. The way the wind moved through the grass. The way two toddlers chased each other, their laughter unburdened. The way the clouds drifted slowly, like they weren't in a hurry to be anything but what they were. That's what I missed most, I think. That feeling. Of being unburdened. When I returned home, the sun had begun its descent, casting the house in long, golden shadows. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a minute, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. He was in the kitchen when I entered, cooking. The scent of garlic and rosemary hit me instantly, simple, warm, familiar. He looked over his shoulder. I figured we both needed something real to eat. I nodded. Smells good. We ate quietly, the clinking of utensils the only sound between us. It wasn't uncomfortable. Just cautious. Like we were both testing how far we could stretch the silence before it snapped. After dinner, I took care of the dishes. He dried. Our hands moved in rhythm, side by side, not touching. The domesticity of it all felt surreal. Like a scene borrowed from another life. One that didn't belong to us. When the last plate was stacked away, I turned to leave the kitchen. He called my name, not loudly, just enough to make me stop. I turned. "We can't keep doing this," he said. "Whatever this is." I waited. Let the pause stretch, not to punish him, but because I didn't know what to say. "I know," I said finally. "But I also don't know what the alternative is." He looked at me then, and there was something vulnerable in his expression, something raw and honest. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said. "I know," I said again. Neither did I. That night, I sat alone in the backyard long after the sun had set. I didn't want to be inside. I didn't want to be near him or away from him. I just wanted space to think, or feel, or maybe just be. The stars were out, faint but visible, scattered across the dark like forgotten pieces of something ancient. I used to stargaze when I was younger. Before life became about bills and responsibilities and dinners no one thanked me for. I used to wonder about the people looking up at the same stars from somewhere else. Now I wondered if someone would someday look back at this chapter of my life and understand it better than I did. By the time I went to bed, the house was dark. I walked past the guest room quietly, not pausing, not knocking. But I knew. And he knew. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Or decisions. Or maybe just more silence. But tonight, for now, we both chose stillness. Because the truth was, even stillness can feel like something when you've gone so long without being seen. The rain started around midnight. I heard it tapping lightly against the windowpane while I lay in bed, eyes wide open in the darkness. It was the kind of rain that made the whole world quieter, like nature itself was urging you to listen. I stared at the ceiling, watching the dim shadows move as the wind shifted through the trees outside. My husband was still away, having extended his trip by another day. His text was short, unremarkable, still tied up with meetings. "Staying overnight again. See you tomorrow." I read it 3 times before locking my phone and placing it face down on the nightstand. The message was simple, but it gave shape to the emptiness I'd been feeling for years. Not because he stayed longer, he often did, but because I realized I wasn't disappointed. I was relieved. The quiet in the house felt different that night. Not heavy, not tense. Just still. And I couldn't pretend anymore that I didn't know what was building inside me. I got out of bed and stood barefoot on the wooden floor. The air was cool against my skin. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, more out of instinct than comfort, and moved quietly through the house, the rain now a steady rhythm outside. The guest room door was closed, but the light underneath told me he was still awake. I stood in the hallway for a long time, my fingers brushing the wall, unsure what I was waiting for. A sign? An excuse? Or simply the courage to act? When I finally knocked, it was so soft I wasn't even sure he heard. But the door opened a few seconds later. We looked at each other for a long time. Neither of us spoke. The hallway was dim, the light behind him casting soft shadows over his face. He stepped aside. We spent the night together. The next morning, the house was filled with a different kind of quiet. A knowing kind. A quiet that didn't need explanation. I woke before he did, the pale light of dawn stretching gently through the curtains. I watched him sleep for a moment, not in awe or wonder, but with something heavier. I felt the weight of everything I had just done. Everything I had become. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, fully dressed, staring at my hands. They looked the same. But nothing else did. When I stepped back into the hallway, the house felt unfamiliar, like I had crossed into another version of my life, one I hadn't been prepared for. I moved silently through the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The window above the sink was fogged with condensation, a small reminder that the outside world still existed, indifferent, untouched. He came into the room not long after. We didn't speak. He reached for the coffee tin, and I stepped aside. Our movements were automatic, practiced, strangely normal. But nothing was normal. He didn't stay long in the kitchen. Just poured his cup, nodded once, and left. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't even surprised. I knew, without needing to ask, that he didn't have the words either. What we'd done wasn't romantic or beautiful. It wasn't impulsive either. It was inevitable. That made it harder. Later that morning, I went outside. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, the air heavy with the scent of damp leaves and earth. I walked barefoot across the patio, the stone cold beneath my feet, and sat on the bench under the arbor. It had been years since I'd sat there. Years since I'd even looked at it. I used to love this spot. In the early years of our marriage, I would sit here and read in the springtime, listening to the birds, feeling the sun warm my skin. Back when I still believed that love would be enough to fill in all the quiet spaces. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sorry for myself. But I felt a kind of sorrow that was harder to name. It wasn't regret. Not exactly. It was the recognition that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. That no matter what I did now, I could never again be the woman who hadn't made that choice. When I finally went back inside, the house was empty. He had gone out, left a note on the table that said he'd be back in the afternoon. No explanation. Just space. I cleaned the kitchen again. Not because it needed it, but because it gave my hands something to do. Something other than shake. By the time my husband texted that he was on his way home, I had already changed the sheets in the guest room. I opened the windows. Lit a candle. Made the house smell like something familiar. He arrived just after sunset. I greeted him at the door, kissed his cheek, took his coat. He smiled, tired, distracted. We talked about his trip. I asked all the right questions. He gave all the usual answers. Nothing in his eyes suggested he noticed the shift in the walls. And maybe he didn't. Maybe he never would. That night, we ate dinner as a family. 3 plates. 3 people. 3 lives tangled in the silence. I watched them speak across the table, 2 men who shared a name and blood but little else. One spoke with easy confidence, the other with polite distance. I saw the flickers in their expressions, the pauses that held more weight than their words. My husband mentioned a project at work. The cousin asked about his schedule for the week. They didn't speak of anything that mattered. Neither did I. When the meal ended, I gathered the plates, rinsed them one by one, and stacked them neatly in the dishwasher. I could hear their footsteps down the hallway, my husband retreating to the bedroom, his cousin to the guest room. Doors closing. Separation restored. But something inside me had changed, and I knew, no matter how quietly we tried to return to before, there would never be a before again. Only the long, uncertain stretch of what came next. And in that stretch, I would have to live with the version of myself I had become. The morning after felt hollow. Not in the way something tragic feels, but in the way that follows a decision you can't take back. I moved through the house like a ghost of myself, performing the same rituals I had for years, making the bed, watering the plants, folding laundry, but none of it felt real. I was simply filling time with movement, hoping that motion would somehow mask the stillness growing inside me. The air in the house was quieter than usual, or maybe I was just more attuned to it. The cousin was still in the guest room, though I hadn't heard a sound from him all morning. My husband had left early again, another meeting in the city, his voice distant and routine as he kissed my temple before walking out the door. "Don't wait up," he said, just like always. And I didn't. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the trees sway slightly in the breeze. It was warm outside, the kind of day that begged for life, open windows, music, laughter. But inside our home, everything felt muted. As if no one dared make noise. I sat down at the table and stared at my coffee. I didn't drink it. I just watched the steam spiral upward and disappear. The silence wrapped around me like a second skin, and I found myself longing for something I couldn't name. It wasn't him. Not the cousin. And not my husband either. It was something simpler. Something like peace. Something like clarity. By midday, I realized I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I needed air. I needed a place that didn't remind me of every choice I had made over the past few weeks. I grabbed my bag, slipped on a pair of sandals, and left without telling anyone. I drove without direction at first, winding through the back roads outside of town. Eventually, I ended up at a small cafe I used to visit when I first moved here, before marriage, before routine, before the quiet had settled into my bones. The place hadn't changed much. The paint on the shutters was chipped, and the sign leaned slightly to one side, but it still felt familiar in a way nothing else did anymore. I sat at a table by the window and ordered tea. I didn't look at my phone. I didn't try to distract myself with anything. I just sat there, watching the world move around me. Strangers passed by on the sidewalk, their lives unfolding in ways I would never know. It comforted me, in a strange way, to realize that the world didn't pause for my choices. That life went on, regardless of what I had done. An older woman sat down at the table next to mine. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, and she smiled politely as she arranged her napkin across her lap. I smiled back, just enough to be polite, and turned my gaze back to the street. After a while, she spoke. "Lovely day, isn't it?" "Yes," I replied softly. "It is." She nodded. "Days like this make you want to start fresh. Like anything's possible." I didn't respond. I just nodded slowly, unsure whether I agreed or not. When I returned home that afternoon, the house felt different. Not quieter, just emptier. The cousin's suitcase was gone. The guest room was neat and untouched, the bed made with hospital corners and the blinds drawn halfway. A small envelope sat on the kitchen counter with my name written in neat handwriting. I didn't open it right away. I walked past it, into the living room, and sat down on the couch. I stared at the envelope from across the room, my heart beating in a slow, dull rhythm. I already knew what it would say. Or at least, I thought I did. When I finally opened it, the note was short. I couldn't stay. I didn't want to make it harder than it already is. Thank you for the quiet moments. I'll carry them with me. That was all. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the envelope. Then I tucked it into the drawer beneath the phone, next to old receipts and takeout menus. Somewhere I knew it wouldn't be found, but I also knew I wouldn't forget where it was. That evening, my husband returned home and greeted me with a kiss on the cheek. He mentioned traffic and meetings, asked what I had done that day. I told him I went for a drive. That I'd needed to clear my head. He nodded, accepting the answer without question. At dinner, we sat across from each other and spoke about nothing. The weather. The price of gas. A neighbor who was selling their house. The kind of conversations that take up space without saying anything at all. When the dishes were washed and put away, we watched the evening news. I pretended to follow the headlines. He fell asleep halfway through, snoring softly with the remote balanced on his chest. I turned off the TV, adjusted the blanket over his legs, and stood there for a moment, staring at him. He looked peaceful. Tired. The same way he had looked every evening for years. And suddenly, I felt a wave of guilt so deep it made my knees weak. Not for what I had done, but for how easily I had come back to this. I walked to the back door and stepped out onto the porch. The sky was darkening, the stars beginning to blink awake one by one. I stood there for a long time, barefoot, the boards cool beneath my feet, and listened to the world go quiet. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just stood there, wrapped in the weight of everything unsaid, everything done, and everything I still couldn't admit out loud. And in that silence, I realized something that I hadn't let myself see until now. He was gone. And I missed him. Not just for what he had been, but for what he had reminded me I was still capable of feeling. And that was what hurt the most. The days that followed moved slowly, like honey in a jar tipped too gently. There was no confrontation. No revelation. Just the quiet persistence of life returning to what it had always been, silent routines, measured steps, and the steady erosion of whatever had once passed for closeness in our marriage. He never asked about the cousin. Never questioned why he left without a goodbye, or why I seemed quieter than usual. He simply accepted it, like he accepted most things, without interest, without suspicion. That, somehow, hurt more than if he'd accused me. Each morning, I woke before him. I would walk through the kitchen, put the kettle on, and watch the steam rise through the dim light of the window. My reflection in the glass looked older, not in the way of wrinkles or time, but in wear. As if some part of me had burned through and was now just ash. He'd come in not long after, still half asleep, brushing past me to reach the fridge, muttering something about work. I'd nod, maybe smile faintly, and we'd continue as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I kept waiting for the sadness to lift. For the ache to dull. But it didn't. If anything, it deepened, becoming more rooted the longer I tried to hide it. There were moments I thought I might forget him, that the cousin's face, his voice, his hands, would all become distant memories. But memory has a way of clinging to the edges of silence. Of sneaking back in through smells and songs and the way sunlight slants across a wooden floor. One afternoon, while cleaning out the drawer by the phone, I came across the envelope again. I had forgotten it was there. Or rather, I had tried to forget. I sat on the floor, legs folded beneath me, and opened it with trembling fingers. "I'll carry them with me," the note had said. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it back into its place. But something in me refused to let it go this time. That small piece of paper became a weight, pressing gently against a part of myself I had worked hard to bury. The part that had dared to feel. Later that night, I stood in the backyard again, the porch light casting a soft glow over the garden. The flowers I had planted earlier that season had begun to fade, their petals curling at the edges. I knelt beside them, running my fingers along their wilted leaves. They were still beautiful, even in decline. It struck me then how much of life is about pretending not to see what's dying. Inside, I could hear the sound of the television, my husband's voice rising in laughter at something he found amusing. I didn't know what show he was watching. I hadn't asked. I hadn't been part of that world for a long time. The next morning, he mentioned taking a short trip. "Just a few days," he said over coffee. "They want me at the regional meeting. Shouldn't be more than 3 nights." I nodded, folding my napkin slowly. "Will you be okay here?" he asked, not unkindly, just distracted. "Yes," I said. "Of course." He kissed my cheek, told me he'd text when he landed, and by noon, he was gone. The silence after the door closed was different this time. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't peaceful either. It simply was. A fact. A space. An echo of the life I had chosen and the pieces I had tried to stitch back together. I walked through the house slowly, as if memorizing its every detail, each corner, each shadow, each room that had once held something heavier than air. Everything was in place. And yet, nothing felt familiar. In the guest room, the bed was still made from the last time he'd left it. I sat on the edge, hands in my lap, breathing slowly. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in weeks. Not because I didn't want to, but because the well had gone dry. What was left inside me wasn't grief. It was something quieter. A kind of resignation. That evening, I opened the windows and let the air move freely through the rooms. I cooked dinner, not because I was hungry, but because I needed something to focus on. I played the radio softly in the background, instrumental music, nothing with lyrics. Words felt too sharp. I ate alone at the table. One plate. One glass. One set of silverware. And for the first time, I realized how empty it felt to fill the silence with nothing but absence. After I cleaned up, I sat in the living room with the lights low. I stared at the same spot on the wall for what must have been an hour, my thoughts drifting somewhere between memory and imagination. I thought about the cousin, not the way he made me feel, but the way he made me remember myself. The self I had left behind. The version of me that laughed without measuring the volume. That looked in mirrors and didn't flinch. That believed there was more waiting on the other side of routine. He had left. But what he awakened hadn't. And now I had to live with it. Before bed, I went to the drawer one last time and removed the note. I read it again, lips barely moving, heart quiet and steady. Then I carried it outside and placed it into the fire pit. It caught flame quickly, curling and blackening until there was nothing left but ash. I watched until the last ember faded. Then I went inside, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't dream.